culture, narrative, and identity. It's really the high time that we need to define, redefine what narrative is. Now, what is a narrative? A narrative may be a story, and you know, it may be an account of events, experiences, and details. It may also refer to the art of storytelling, or it's a storytelling kind of a process. Term narrative is a wide term. A novel which may be written from the point of view of the main character is also a narrative. There can be an article written by a blogger which can be a narrative, who writes about his experiences or her experiences. That can be a narrative. If you look at narrative, then there are narrative poems also, narrative works of visual art, narrative essays, narrative dances, and so many. So the term narrative is very wide. So is the word culture is very wide. As far as we can see the narrative, sometimes we can say it is a vivid narrative. Here the word narrative is a noun. But we say the narrative skill or the narrative art, then in that case it becomes an adjective. So in both the senses, the narrative word is highly pregnant with the meaning, loaded with the meaning. So let us see that everyone likes narrative because narrative has a mission to perform. Narrative therefore can be an engaging writing style. You can engage the readers along with you. You invite the readers, invite the audience to your own world with some kind of perspective, and you are telling them a story and they are participating in your story. So you can easily build a narrative alongside, and therefore narratives are also social. And when you communicate, when there are if you see the definitions, descriptions, discussions of what narrative are, then there are many references to natural humanity of narratives. Now let me say that what about literature now? Narrative and literature. Narratives, as you know, they are found everywhere in literature. They can appear in style and form, in different form. One such example is Don Quixote, and therefore Cervantes, which is prescribed. It is the tale of a man who is determined to be a knight, and you may remember references to a madman on horseback fighting windmills. So you have a standard and this classic example in the narrative wise. Another example of narrative can be called Nobel Prize winning author Toni Morrison, who won Nobel Prize in the year uh, uh, from American Nobel laureate, Beloved. It is a tale of an escaped slave who remains haunted by things in her past. It is yet another modern and groundbreaking sort of a narrative. The Hobbit, which is by Tolkien, is again a popular story. It's a fantasy creature, and they're called a hobbit who travels through the Middle Earth and has got unexpected adventures. Is also a first-person narrative. Narratives are written sometimes in first-person narrative, in the third-person narrative. An example of non-fiction can also be a narrative. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is an autobiography of a man who was a slave. He was a writer, a newspaper editor, and from the historical perspective, that was a narrative. Pop culture literature is also there. Pop culture narratives are also there. Narrative pop culture, you can say, is a system of a story that weave in and out of one another to make up the story of the human race. Culture is open-ended and it's always evolving, ever growing. So is narrative. So what is it that makes a narrative? Sometimes we participate in our own stories, in the stories of other people. So these are some of the examples where you can see the narrative taking a shape. Sometimes you'll be surprised to know that even the headlines of the newspapers are very tricky. They become narrative, or they convey symbolically sometime a narrative. And therefore, in social media, you can see this narrative taking a shape. So, in a few words, in a picture can be a kind of a narrative because it may, narrate something, connote something, denote something. It may stand for many things. So, blogs are also examples of narratives, stories, and there are first account of experiences in travelogues can be. Another area is music, which can be wonderful place to find narratives. And therefore, people turn to their stories into songs. And narrative style, you might have heard about various fiction writers. We talk about what is their narrative style. And you try to analyze style and try to find out and confirm the narrative which is working, operating. But I would say that narrative is also narrative is also like a software program working behind the mind, behind the framework, social, intellectual, our psychological framework. This can be a sort of a software which operates behind us, which makes us, our thoughts, our character, our thinking, our ideology, our own stories, our own experiences, they all mingle with it, and then they give a shape to the narrative. We do something with an objective, we do something with a purpose, and you know some kind of a motive that provides it is the narrative. Motive may be a national narrative, maybe a personal narrative, maybe a social narrative, literary, culture, and so on. So narrative is a spoken or written account of related events conveyed using literary techniques and devices. Now the definition has been bit revised. Narratives are seen throughout the written works. In other media, it is there in the prose, it is there in the poetry, it is in the movies, it is in the films, it is in the television, it is in the theater, it is in the music, it is in the video games, it is in the podcast. So narrative can be found, and it is a different thing that for the same thing, the people may have different narratives. Just like active lends a color to the narrative. In Chaucer's time, there were Canterbury tales. Storytelling was an art, and it is rooted in the tradition itself. So you can see the myths, legends, fables, ballads, stories, folk tales even. They were performed. For example, the narrative can be described in the kind of enactment of staging of Ramayana, Mahabharata. Different narratives exist. It is your point of view, it is your perspective that will give a shape and color to it. So there are many examples of narratives which can be explained. But there are certain features, characteristics. What ultimately are the ingredients of the narrative? What are the constituent elements which make up the narrative? How the narrative is built up? Number one, first of all, the elements of narrative can be that you have to build a narrative. Writers have to rely on, or the storytellers, they depend upon many things. And the list is endless, but some of them features, most often the literary writers, they depend upon the characters. I think this theory of narration, this theory of narratives starts from the Aristotle's Poetics. And Aristotle has first given the shape of, in his theory of dramaturgy, what narratives are. So characterization, conflict, which is there, the element of conflict. There can be a linear narration, there can be a non-linear narration. There is a point of view in the narration and the tone also. And one more thing, perspective. Now what about characterization? The literary technique develops stories' characters. And there are usually two types of characters. One are direct characters, others are indirect characters. There are explicit characters, there are implicit characters. Direct characters, indirect characters. Now what are these direct characters? Direct characterization is when the narrator tells the audience specific details about a character. Then that's a direct one. The information is provided by, when the information is provided by another character for some other character, then it can be indirect also. Indirect characterization is when the audience must, so one is the direct, where either the author is introducing the character, is directly telling us, or some other character in the story is telling something about the character, then that is in direct narration. What is indirect characterization? It is when the audience have to infer, they have to deduce, they have to find out the various aspects of a character for themselves by observing the characters, the thought process, physical description, behavior, or dialogue. So there is internal conflict, external conflict, and there are opposition of forces and opposition of people. Conflict between the protagonist and the villain, conflict within the mind of the protagonist, within the heart of the protagonist. There are two categories of conflict. One is internal conflict, other is external conflict. Internal conflict exists only as a man versus self. Internal, when man, like Hamlet's dilemma, to be or not to be. He is in conflict with himself. Even when he sees the Claudius praying and kneeling down for prayers, he doesn't kill him because he wants to kill him. But there is a conflict going on inside his mind. And there is a brooding, there is a speculation, constant indulging in thought, obsessive thinking. Sometimes all that lead to confusion, and they all lead to internal conflicts. Internal conflicts is the you know is the hallmark of the special characteristic or feature of the modern writings. Internal conflicts is when a man fights with himself, when a character experiences opposing emotions or desires simultaneously. You are on the horns of a dilemma. You are torn between the two worlds. Then that is why you have. Then man versus man, or man has conflict with the nature, or man has conflict with the society, man is in conflict with the technology, man is in conflict with the supernatural. So these conflicts, narratives are built up on these conflicts as well, which is an ingredient of these narrative. Now narrative's conflict constitutes the protagonist struggle against forces outside themselves. For example, old man and the sea. The old man struggling and fighting against the, and there can be also an ancient rhyme of man mariner, later story. There are many stories, underlying stories, and there are many stories going on, and the technique is unifying the story narratives by giving them transitions from one narrative to another narrative, from one story to another, and then we have from these subsets we have the higher framework of stories operating. Narratives operates, or narratives are built up. So you can see, I will give you the example of Geoffrey Chaucer as well, that how in Canterbury Tales are very good example of these narratives. We have the Odyssey, written by Homer's epic poem, and then we have Chaucer's Canterbury Tale, Ovid's Metamorphosis, and there are so many. Another thing is the element is the linear and the non-linear sort of a thing. You see the order in the postmodern framework, the stories don't move in linear progression, and they have multi-layer stories embedded one after the another like hypertext, and they are connected with the time frame. You have a time, present, past, and future, and the past is not just the past but becomes the inner reflections of the author, and he builds up, the author, the writer, or the character builds up a narrative. He goes back and forth into the time frame, goes into the past, protagonist goes into the past, comes back into the present, and switching over past and present. So past is not the time which is just bygone, but the past is still alive. It lives through the soul, through the inner reflections of the poet or the author or the writer or the protagonist. So you can see that, and each story, each event is linked up to the past, to the present, and future. And there are various frames operating, stream of consciousness technique, multi-layer text postmodern framework, and therefore fragmented stories. Sometimes one story, one episode unfolds many hidden, unsaid, untold stories by the writer, and the connection we can see is pervasive. Author chooses to recount events in a chronological order, then that is a linear. When you go in a chronological manner, it is linear one. But when you don't follow a sequence, sometimes you go into the present, sometimes you go. Most of the movies nowadays, you can see they go into the flashbacks, come to the present, go into the flashback. So that you see there is a non-linear progression in the narrative. It's a very effective method. It is effective method also, that how non-linear progression helps build up different kind of narratives, and perspective can be proper shared by proper connection of the things. That is how the writer is able to connect the present, contrast it and with the past, and offer a comparative. So non-linear narration adds aesthetic interest to a written work and also builds up emotional resonance. This is a very good technique. Another we can see, as the story goes with its own speed or with its own pace, it is controlled through elements like many scenes. There are length of the scenes, depth of description. This is narrative technique. This part comes under the narrative technique also. Depth of description, intensity and frequency of action, genre often affects this pacing, and therefore we have horror, detective stories, crime thrillers which show narrative, and we also have now finally the perspective. The perspective. Narrator or speaker provides a story with some point of view, with motive, which perspective becomes the soul of this narrative. And the narrative happens to see it and he describes accordingly. Now, the point of view can be many types of point of view can be there. So, when you read a narrative, you try to see what point of view is there and what perspective is there. For example, there can be a first person narration where everything is narrated from a one single character using the uh, I, I pronoun, and usually the words are used by the writer is I, me, mine, and so on. Sometimes it is in the second person. The reader becomes a character. The reader also participates into it, and then you have third person narration. Then you have lastly another aspect which is the tone. Tone of the narration is also important. For example, if you see the general character or attitude or the tone, whether you can see if the tone is very harsh, if it is cruel, if it is full of hate speech, if it is hatred, if it is warmth, if it is with empathy, or so you can see the tone and such things are. So attitudes and emotions matter a lot. For example, somebody tells a narrative, then there is some kind of talki, sometimes of uh, sometimes of a uh, uh, depression, anger, distress behind what he speaks. There can be a romantic, elegiac, optimistic narration as well, and that's why you see that some are elegies and some are, you know, and therefore, objectively, in this way, and there can be a neutral. So tone can be also. Now let us talk about that in terms of poetry. Narrative does not. Narrative is not simply with the fiction. It is not limited to, or not restricted to fiction, or non-fiction, or theatre. Even the poems have these narratives. There are long, long poems, and sometimes they offer you narratives like Ancient Mariner, Canterbury Tales. The poems focus on an image, they focus on an emotion, or they on an idea or a mood. And other poems sometimes they focus on the story, they tell a story. When series of events are presented in a poem, episodic events are there, or events come after the other, then it is a narrative poem. For example, some of the examples can be given here, like the epic, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and therefore Canterbury Tales is a wonderful example of Chaucer. Tennyson has written a poem, The Lady of Shalott, which can be a very good example. And now, question is that why should we use narrative? Why should we write in narrative? Why this device and narrative art and narrative devices are needed? Because narrative is the only thing, it has manifold function to perform. There are many functions to perform. One is to keep the readers or the audience engaged. The stronger the narrative is, then it can increase the effect of characterization. It can increase the effect of emotional intensity. And it can increase the effect of aesthetic elements. So, and therefore, you are also, okay, what next? What next will follow? Therefore, that is why in the web series, if the web series are successful and they have a narrative to follow, then you wait for the next episode, what next, what next. But if a web series is not following a narrative, at the end of the last episode, you will realize that you have been really befooled by the director and the producer, and it has been a sheer waste of time watching hours and hours together till 2 o'clock in the midnight and wasting your precious time on watching that something fruitful will come, some analysis will come, some message will come, but after the end, there are many such stories, or even on the web series, which we are lacking in this vital element of narrative. And finally, they just in the last episode, they just wind up and bring it to a close without. So, a good narrative will take you further. What next? And therefore, it arouses your own involvement. You get involved with it, with your own intellect, with your own mind. Oh, this is a state of affairs, and it leaves you in a thinking mood, in a reflection. You begin to reflect on many things because of that. So, that is how a compelling narrative or a strong narrative always keeps the readers interested. So a narrative has a great relation. This is what Aristotle has also said. I'll come to the Aristotle's theory of poetics, certain vital points which are related to the narrative aspect. So narrative has a big relation with the plot and the story. Plot. For example, Aristotle has said that six constituents of tragedy are: number one, plot; second is character; third is thought; then fourth is diction; and then there is a song; then there is a spectacle, and so on. So character comes first, plot comes first, and then comes the character. So plot and story is the essential element. So plot is a series of events. They can be arranged in a linear manner, or nowadays most of the writers, they prefer to write in a non-linear manner. In a flash book, there can be a stream of consciousness technique. There can be multiple layers of meaning and multiple plots and stories embedded within each other. So what happens is, the plots, stories are arranged deliberately, and they try to reveal emotional and thematic and dramatic aspects. Uh, E.M. Forster has said in aspects of the novel, he says, the king died and then a queen died is a story. There was a king, there was a queen, the king also died and the queen died. The king died and then the queen died. Of grief is a plot. Now you need to fill, you need to add of grief, and therefore you need to add a plot in it, and therefore that is why you have to bring in narrative in the story. And narrative includes the sequence. That was a story, and the narrative is a series of events occurring one after the other. May not be but it also tells you about narrative. The story simply tells you the story. There was a king, there was a queen, both of them died. The story finished. But the narrative will tell you about the causes, cause and effect, about the causes, about the effects, about the meaning of these events. Meaning of events means plot structure. Only the plot structure can give you the meaning, and therefore such techniques are employed. And that is why techniques and decisions are used. And therefore, a story is just, what is the difference between a story and a narrative? A story is simply what happens, and the plot includes the how and why, the significance of what, the underlying motive behind it, and the narrative is how what happens is also reflected upon, is therefore. Now, S.T. Coleridge's example, like the rhyme of Ancient Mariner, let us see. Most of the students or participants are aware of this, a very common and popular work written by S.T. Coleridge. Coleridge's long narrative poem, opens with the Ancient Mariner who stops the wedding guest, who is with two companions in the street. So, and therefore, how the story begins. The wedding guest wishes to continue on his way. He is unable to resist the compelling story of the mariner's, that is ill-fated journey, and the sin of killing an albatross. Coleridge now hits upon this idea. He utilizes this narrative technique of a frame story to contain the this mariner's tale within the larger experience of the wedding guest who learns from the mariner. So this is a good example, you can say, that how the narrative is applied to a story. And there are other examples can be given. For example, what is the purpose of Chaucer in describing Canterbury Tales? What could be the narrative? And therefore, these narratives, sometimes, critics, these are all subject to interpretation, perspective to offer. And in Toni Morrison, you can see there is a non-linear narrative, and there are shifting points of view. Sometimes the writers employ a narrative style shifting technique, foreshadowing technique, style shifting. At this point of time, this is the style, and they suddenly move on to the another style. There is a style contrast in the same paragraph, in the same situation, which shows a fragmented effect. It creates a fragmented effect. It's a shifting point of view, and therefore there is a foreshadowing. Sometimes they employ this technique. They use other linguistic narrative techniques as well, from stylistics point of view, which in sum total we can say that narratives refer to a story that is told, of course, but narratives are crafted with some particular ideas. Remember, so this is the difference now. Narratives are crafted with particular ideas, viewpoints, and the thesis. There is a thesis statement. There is some finding on the part of the narrator which he wants to share. So they contain a central idea and these aspects. So telling the related events in a cohesive format around a central idea or a theme. Now, literary elements, as I talked about, they enhance those, you know, emotion, heighten the effect, and therefore a narrative becomes a framework of that. What is, after all, the purpose? This it is the instinctual human desire for every man to narrate, to tell stories, and to be more engaged in a work of writing. So, narratives, what purpose do they serve? They supply you with the information, they inform you, educate you, refine your, add to your perception, add to your knowledge, for example, and they also amuse you and entertain you, depending upon what the message is being shared. Now, coming to the culture part, narratives also reveal cultural truths, which narratives share cultural truths, and also the conspicuous aspects of the cultural truths, and also the hidden aspects, concealed aspects, and through the narratives they are brought to the fore, they are brought to the forefront. And sometimes, narratives from different cultures, they operate with different perspectives, and then we can, for example, Sula by Toni Morrison. It tells the story of Toni Morrison is a Nobel Prize winning author, American. She has written Sula, and that tells the story of what it is to grow up rural, African, American, and female in a time when racial segregation was being accepted. Apartheid, the case of apartheid, racial segregation. So this narrative serves to emphasize the emotion of a girl as she grows into adulthood and learns the depth of human connection. So what the novel is doing in this narrative, it sheds insight into the intimate thoughts and feelings of this character, and also with a message to the white literary world that shows the richness. This is the what is the the technique of Toni Morrison, that how she describes the narrative in such a manner. So in narrative, you can see that central themes are there, of course, motives have to be there, ideas have to be there, and therefore the elements that I told you. But this narrative is such a term nowadays that it pops up everywhere. In film and literature also, narrative is there. In college curriculum, narrative, for example, how the history is being written nowadays. Sir talked about this. The history that has been written in India by Indians, or Indian history, and what narrative is working behind it, what history is prescribed in college curriculums, how literature is being propagated. So there are, if tomorrow, if I try to touch, many narratives are there from the point of view of Subhash Chandra Bose, there are many narratives from the point of view of Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, which people often discuss, contrast and contradict. Different narratives are operating behind Indian history. So it depends upon what are those people who have written this Indian history. Whatever is written in Indian history, if you read the history of that India from Pakistan's point of view, Kashmir's point of view, there will be different narratives operating, different myths, many forms of narrative are prevalent, and therefore the definition can be elusive also, and therefore form and function. So narratives, you can see they are everywhere, but the definition which I gave you in the beginning, that when literary touch is given, literary devices are being used, and then in that case it is a, so narratives are there. Even in video games, narratives are there, they are prepared with some narrative. Even in graphic novels, journalism, newspaper comes to you, TV channels, they're all channels, they transmit news with their own narratives and perspective. One channel may go in a different way. All the newspaper we say that they are pro Congress or pro BJP. They have their own narratives to offer, myths and legends, and therefore even Ramayana, many aspects, incidents, characters, situations are being redefined, reanalyzed, and reinterpreted. So it's a good thing that narrative gives you the. But I must say that here, every literature, every piece of literature is not a narrative. It can't be a narrative. And every piece of narration, every narrative cannot be a literature. Remember, every narrative is not a literature, every literature is not a narrative. We must have clear cut boundaries about this. Even in the world of sports, even in the digital world, these narratives are operating. So narrative's purpose is always that it expresses, number one, what narrative does after all. Let me bring the point home. It expresses our individual thoughts and feelings, number one. Of course, our thoughts includes your idea, your ideology, and your own reflections. Then it creates a cautionary tales about what could happen if you are not careful. This is also the purpose of narrative. Foreshadowing. Then it gives you the hint, it gives you the clue, it cautions you, gives you a warning. So this is also the purpose of narrative. That is why writers are writing these narrative. And they can create morality tales, and then they can help us to be a good, how people should behave, how should be the good people. And narrative also gives us lot of information, adds to our knowledge about the lives of the other people, about the social life, political life, and tries to bring out certain aspects which can add to our. Then narratives have another function to perform. They inspire us to keep going through difficult times. And there are like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, and they also inspire us to keep going during difficult times. And therefore you can see that. So the importance of narratives cannot be denied after all. And personal narrative sometimes becomes the individual threads, and they weave the fabric of humanity. Individual threads can weave the fabric of humanity, and therefore we can understand each other's so narratives are a wonderful tool, wonderful phenomena of human communication. So narratives are a, you can say, an excellent device, literary device, even cultural device of human communication. Literature, you can say, therefore, is one of the primary expressions of narrative. And quest narratives also. Many types of quest. If a protagonist is going some kind of personal transformation, then those are quest narratives. And then we have famous quests like some example like Odyssey is a famous quest of a great warrior and Trojan War and whatnot. So, and sometimes it gives you the emotional journey of the protagonist, spiritual journey and spiritual suffering of the protagonist, and they give you the physical journey of the protagonist. And therefore these narratives are an important um, you know part of literature. Now every narrative is not a literature, but they are important. Just like I say, पैसा सब कुछ होता है, money is everything. Money can do a lot. Money has great importance, but it is not everything. पैसा है, बहुत मायने रखता है, पर पैसा सब कुछ नहीं है. So narrative is like an essential ingredient, and therefore even in the movie Star Wars you have narration behind it. And in character traits are also, the traits of the characters are also highlighted through these narrative. In cultural narrative, as I say, if I talk about culture, and these narratives can help establish identities also. Identities maybe of a person, place, or a thing, or a nation. Identities. Cultural identity also. And cultural narratives are stories that can help a community structure, and they give meaning to its history and existence. So cultural narratives define and redefine your history and your own existence. So it also serves the purpose of philosophy. Cultural narratives include creation of stories. Sometimes we have to create stories. We have to tell a story about the community's origins. We have to tell fables. If you read Canterbury Tales, you will find these aspects. Cultural narratives help a community reinforce societal norms. So, see the function of narratives here in cultural and social, connecting culture and society, civilization and culture, both, and connecting it with the history, and therefore strengthening the identity, which seems to be the very sole purpose of this seminar: culture, narrative, culture, and identity. So, how identity is the process, stage wise process that has evolved through shared knowledge and the experience. So, this is how we can say that, and this narrative mode of is it's wide pervasive. It is everywhere. For example, if I talk about finally, I would like close with the Aristotle's, which I told you about, Aristotle's world. Now, Aristotle was there in 322 BC, 389 to 322 BC. So, the history of poetics, if you look at the entire history of poetics, even till the middle of the 20th century, even 21st century now, you know that we have not paid a very good attention to the narrative components of literary text, which are core narrative, means narrative elements, which are, now there is a very, in verbal language, non-verbal languages. Now narratives can be in verbal language means literature, and non-verbal languages also. And therefore Aristotle's poetics, which is based on the mimesis of human action, keeps its grip on narrative theory. So narrative theory, originates like from, and after Aristotle, you know there was the lyric form, ballad, dramatic genres, narrative theories were framed, and this aspect of narration was developed. So with this Aristotle, I want to say that being the originator of this, so we have another term, narratology, you can say. I am discussing Aristotle a little bit for 2-3 minutes, and terms like narratology, frameworks, and these even the act of story, the actors and the characters, and the tragic mode of drama, and the various kind of aspects. So we can connect this narration now with katha also. Katha, which is a Hindi term, katha has also a wider implications, and are the mimesis of the evolutive world, as you can see. So with this point of view, I think there are so many things to say about narrative. There are many theories, many frameworks, various models, various narrative features which can be described. But finally, I would say that narrative is present in every speech act. Narrative becomes the concept of the set of features. Narrative is the set of features that allows us to call some text or acts of communication narrative, and therefore we can see these are the acts of communication. So narrative is an important ingredient, and therefore there are various aspects of it, and there are various models. Culture and narrative and identity is very abstract, very wide, and full of philosophy, and there are various shades and various offshoots and branches of it. And in the word literature itself, the very word literature and literary is full of difficulties, and so because the word narrative has wider implication, so the word literature has also wider implications.